Now, the United States says it has seized 2 oil tankers with connections to Venezuela, one that's reported to be empty and one that was boarded in the North Atlantic. Now, the U.S. Coast Guard had been pursuing it for weeks since intercepting it off the Venezuelan coast. And during the chase, it changed its name and adopted a Russian flag. But for more of the story and the Russian connection, we cross now live to SABC News correspondent Dasha Chernyshova, who's in Moscow. Dasha, good morning. So any response to these developments from the Russian authorities?
Well, indeed, we've heard the Russian Foreign Ministry issuing a statement and urging the United States to provide for the humane and dignified treatment of the Russian nationals who were on board of that oil tanker, because Russia is saying that the tanker came under the Russian flag and started sailing under the Russian flag back on the 24th of December 2025. So Russia is now demanding the uninterfered release and transfer of those nationals to the Russian soil. And the Russian Transport Ministry has earlier been issuing its own statement suggesting that what has happened led to the failure of connection between this tanker and the Russian side. So as of 12 GMT on Wednesday, there's been no contact between the tanker and the Russian side. Now, Russia has been quite critical of what has happened with the Russian authorities. Some lawmakers saying that the actions of the United States, they amount to the piracy, and the Russian officials saying that on the high sea there is the freedom of navigation, and it is absolutely against the UN Convention on Maritime Law of 1982 to any country to get on board of another vessel on the high sea without their own permit. So this has been described as the violation of the international maritime law in Russia as well. And obviously the question is how this is all going to affect the restoration of the ties between Moscow and Washington and wider geopolitical context as well.
Dasha, as you say, Russia calling it piracy, the United States, for their part, saying that these vessels were part of a shadow fleet that were trying to evade sanctions that were meant to restrict Venezuela and other actors from exporting oil illegally. Is this something that the Russian authorities also mentioned or tried to respond to?
Well, the Russian authorities have said that this oil tanker has started navigating under the Russian flag very late last year, and as of that, they stress that all of the international laws on that have been adhered to and they have been respected. Therefore, Moscow is saying that what the US has done is the violation of those international norms. But having said that, you have to keep in mind that this tanker, according to the reports from the Russian Foreign Ministry and as well as Russian media, has been shadowed by the U.S. Coast Guard vessel for weeks, and we're also hearing that this tanker has not been violating the territorial waters of any country. It has not been sailing in the territorial waters of the United States. The Russian authorities have been saying that it was about 4,000 kilometers away from the boards, from the territorial, from the coast board of the United States, and thus Russia has been saying that that's excessive attention that has been given to this oil tanker has created some sort of abnormal situation.
And how significant is this proving to be, just in terms of how the government in Russia is responding, but also just generally how the population is feeling and responding to this, given the broader context of US-Russia relations?
Well, if you look at the reaction of the public, you would definitely see many saying that what's happening is sort of piracy in the 21st century, and many are raising their eyebrows at how the things are developing around Venezuela and how things are developing around this tanker with all that happening in broad daylight. We're also hearing from Russia some of the political analysts suggesting that Russia's response so far has been too mild, and there has to be a much harsher line taken by the Russian authorities with regard to those actions by the United States, because in Moscow there is the perception that everything the US is doing is just done with neglect to the international norms, and this is not true the way that Moscow would like that to be operated. But having said that, the suggestion was that Moscow would try to keep things down with Washington, not to interfere with the restoration of that bilateral track that we have seen just recently with Trump administration coming into the Oval Office and trying to mend ties with Moscow. And obviously the Ukraine conflict being one of the topics that they are talking about, and one of the hinders on the way to normal relations between Russia and the United States. So the perception here in Russia is that Russia will try not to escalate these conflicts even further, just trying to keep it down and making sure that its track with Washington is okay. But at the same time, it's unclear how Moscow would respond looking forward.
And just the final one, Dasha, with relation to investment, Russian investment in the Venezuelan oil industry in particular, given the posture that Washington has now adopted. Has anything been said about that?
Well, Moscow has had decades of good relations with Caracas, and that has been one of the backbones of Russia's geopolitics in this hemisphere. Obviously, many political analysts have been saying that the events unfolding in Venezuela are just depriving Russia of one of its key allies in that region. Again, Moscow has condemned the U.S. actions in Venezuela, calling them an act of armed aggression. And obviously for Moscow it is making things much more complicated. But then you look at the wider geopolitical conflict and context, and this is where you see Russia trying to mend ties with Washington and trying to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. So all those issues, according to political analysts, are much intertwined, and therefore we're just yet to see how Russia will be taking on that, because so far there's been no statement from the Kremlin on the developments there. Russia is on lengthy Christmas and New Year holidays, and obviously question is how that will be affecting this wider geopolitical context. But for now it does seem that Moscow has been issuing statements condemning what has happened and not really doing anything in practice on how to help Venezuela with that. But obviously there are questions whether Russia is able to do anything at this stage besides condemning and supporting politically the Venezuelan side.
Dasha, thanks so much. That's SABC News correspondent Dasha Chernyshova speaking to us from Moscow.